It was the winter of 2018, and a new animated movie had hit the theaters which had gotten people talking. But of all things, this was a superhero movie. And at this point, there was no denying it. 2018 was one of the best years for superheroes, with movies like Deadpool 2, Black Panther, and even The Incredibles 2 quenching the rampant thirst for superheroes, which was only topped off by none other than Infinity War itself. The year was just perfect. But when it seemed like the best had come to pass for the year of 2018 and the long wait had started for the final chapter of Marvel, words had started to spread about this new animated Spider-Man movie, which caught me off guard just a little. In all honesty, I was thinking, why do we need an animated Spider-Man movie of all things? But when this movie finally arrived, a fascination had begun to grow, and you could almost sense there was something going on here. And all of a sudden, people were getting excited. A movie that didn't really arrive with a lot of hype was definitely getting a lot of it. So naturally, this had me intrigued. I wanted to know why almost everyone that I know of was talking about this movie. And then I had the chance to watch it. And that's when I knew that I was watching something that was not just different in every sense of the word, but something that I had never seen before, and therefore couldn't really put into words. It was the most beautiful movie that I had seen in a really long time. And I could reiterate this again and again and again. This movie was different. It looked different. It felt different. And it even sounded different. And that's when I knew that this movie was gonna single-handedly save Western animation. Now, this is a questionable feeling to have, and I'm aware of that. The word save might be a bit of a stretch to describe an industry that has grown leaps and bounds in the past 2 decades. Hollywood animated features have become much more prevalent and accepted. And it is for this same reason that the top 10 highest grossing animated movies of all time have all come in the past decade. And yes, I do concede, these are signs of progression. But when I had a glimpse at the Spider-Verse, it opened my eyes to what animation truly is. Or to rephrase it, what animation can be. And after which, when I looked at the broad spectrum of animation, or to be specific, the Hollywood side of it, I saw unrivaled success, no doubts about it, but deep within this success was ingrained a formula. Something that helped studios to make successful movies, but in doing so, it restricted the progress of art itself. There's a reason why a lot of these movies look the same, and it's something that I never realized until I went into the Spider-Verse. But in order to truly appreciate, no, to celebrate art, one must ask the question, how did we get here? It all goes back to the early 1900s. Okay, perhaps that might be a bit too far. Let's move it a bit forward. So, it all goes back to the 90s. You see, the first ever 3D animation was created in the early 60s. And it wouldn't be until the 80s when Hollywood would get interested in this rather peculiar piece of technology. And at the helm of this movement was none other than George Lucas, who was fascinated by CGI. And through his movies, this technology began to grow. And at the turn of the 90s, most of the major blockbusters were in some way, shape or form using a bit of CGI. And in 1992 came VeggieTales, a show that's widely regarded as the first fully 3D animated cartoon. But it would take 3 more years for 3D animation to hit the mainstream. And thus, in the year of 1995 was born Toy Story, the first ever fully 3D animated feature film, created by a rather humble and tiny company at the time called Pixar. The success of Toy Story was incredible, or perhaps even groundbreaking. So much so that Disney, who were the kingpins of animation around this time, wanted a slice of this pie. And it wouldn't be long until other studios got hold of this new technology and started making their own feature films. The 3D revolution had begun in the world of animation. But amidst this revolution, where technology was getting better and better with every passing year, something interesting happened that perhaps people couldn't have expected. When the 90s saw a celebration of 2D animation, with Disney being at the forefront of everything good with this beautiful medium, there was a change in the wind in Western animation. After the worldwide success of 3D animated features like Toy Story 2 and Shrek, The 2000s started seeing less and less of hand-drawn animation. This inherently was not an issue, because why would it be? These movies were magnificent, and we obviously accepted them with open arms. With every brand new movie, there was an anticipation and a sense of wonder, which is something that I dearly enjoyed for a really long time with 3D animation. But all that's good must come to a pass. Or in this scenario, all that's good must become mechanical. Unless you change, unless you rediscover, unless you innovate, you run the risk of stagnation. And this is a feeling that has been festering in my mind for the past decade or so. Every passing movie had a great story, but in terms of the art, it failed to capture my imagination. Of course, every now and again, something would come along that would change it to an extent, but then back we went to the same old look. In a strange way, this very specific style had become the standard, and there was no need for studios to experiment with art anymore. And as these 3D animated features started exhibiting patterns, it was all but certain. Animation, which was meant to be a medium, had almost become a genre. And at this point, it felt like 3D animation needed something different. Something that would remind people of what animation truly represents. Something that would put the art back in animation. Enter the Spider-Verse. Great movies are hard to come by, but when they do, they don't just leave without a mark. They spark a revolution. And you didn't even have to watch the full movie to realize this. It was obvious. This movie was not just animation, but this movie was also art. While 3D animation was striving for photorealism, Spider-Verse took a step back to appreciate the spirit of creativity. It was expressive in every sense of the word, with visuals that none had ever seen before. It was imaginative and vibrant, and it felt like an experiment coming together into completion. Spider-Verse, quite simply, was the most beautiful animated movie I had ever seen in Hollywood. You see, when studios became comfortable with a certain style of animation that worked really well for them, from a business standpoint, it made sense to continue to make similar sort of movies. A nod to the famous quote, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." This method was unbelievably lucrative, and the sheer numbers pulled by some of these animated movies from the previous decade points to this very fact. But I think it would be unfair to claim that a lot of these movies were just cash grabs, because quite simply, they weren't. While I do think that some of these movies were oversimplified or reduced versions of the prequels, there were some that exceeded my expectations to the point where I found myself thoroughly enjoying them. But none of them had the X factor. They never dared to be different. But in December of 2018, when Spider-Verse came along, it broke this mold forever. From a list of great animated movies, it stuck out like a sore thumb. But saying that Into the Spider-Verse was just different wouldn't even begin to scratch the surface of how good a movie it really is. In reality, it was not just a great animated movie, but rather, it was truly a celebration of art. When the artists arrived to work on this movie, as per the visual effects supervisor, Danny Dimian, the artists were asked to reconsider their workflow. They were told, "If it ain't broke, then break it." Now this saying goes against everything that's part of modern day animation, because once you step out of that comfort zone or the normality of a trend, you run the risk of changing things too much, and this inadvertently could be detrimental to the movie's success. But as they say,
you mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling.
The imagination of the Spider-Verse began with the adaptation of a brand new visual style. A never-before-seen visual language that was inspired by the very source of almost all superheroes, comics. When I watched the first couple of shots from this movie, it was quite obvious, as I told myself, "Whoa, this actually looks like a comic book." It felt like this was a visual style that was begging to be utilized. It made perfect sense, a comic book coming alive in the form of animation. Every element in the frame had a bit of character to it, as if it had jumped right out of a comic book. But to further the immersion of an animated comic book, the artists also implemented a technique called halftoning. which is a famous printing technique used in comic books that breaks down images into a series of dots, which gives these frames a gradient-like look. It's quite easy to mistake the Spider-Verse for a fully hand-drawn conventional 2D movie. Everything about it from a distance would suggest that, but it simply isn't one. At its core, it's a 3D animated movie, but unlike the traditional CGI, it's a lovely blend of both mediums. Layers and layers of hand-drawn 2D elements laid upon a 3D foundation. A process that was ridiculously meticulous that it took almost 150 animators almost 4 years to complete this project. But if you ask me, this 2D look is what sells the movie, and the reason why you feel like the animation is a comic book coming to life. You see, a comic book is raw and unpolished, with a hell of a lot of imperfections that creates a very distinct style. And in order to be true to the source, the movie's workflow had to include line work, which was another rigorous process for the animators, an extra step for sure, but these lines added so much detail to every frame of the movie. These lines give an extra layer of impact to every facial movement and every emotion that when Miles is angry or confused or sad, there's a set of line work that makes it visibly impactful. And in certain other scenes, these lines are all over the place. In the backgrounds, in the form of harsh outlines, sometimes squiggly and colorful. And when you see enough of these scenes, the line work almost becomes subliminal, and you barely even notice them anymore, because it's part of the visual style. It is part of the Spider-Verse. Spider-Verse opened up new avenues of animation that people never knew existed. How do you make sure that the visual language doesn't stray from the comic book style? Well, why not displace the color channels of the background to create sort of a chromatic aberration to emulate depth of field? I mean, how do you even know if it's gonna work? And there's a moment when you realize that this movie completely messes with some of the basics of animation, such as in some of these scenes where basic physics such as motion blur gets thrown out of the window to only be replaced by an artistic version of line work. In this shot, what you're seeing are hand-drawn lines of motion that sort of creates this perceived motion blur. And sometimes these motion lines would turn to distorted geometrical shapes or smeared colors, or my personal favorite, multiple limbs that would appear in certain frames to create that feeling of motion. This movie is as expressive as I've seen 3D animation get in a Hollywood movie. And of course, I keep mentioning Western animation as a different entity to this movie only because the Spider-Verse has more in common with an expressive medium like an anime, more so than a Pixar or a Disney movie. Traditionally, 3D animated films in Hollywood are animated on ones, which means that every image is held on the screen for one frame. And in order to achieve the typical 24 frames per second of a motion picture, you get 24 images per every second of film. And this is what makes this animation seem realistic. But Spider-Verse was not really looking for realism. Its visual language was a realm within a comic book. And in order to achieve this unpolished and punchy style, it did something unconventional. Rather than animating on ones, a lot of these scenes were animated on twos, meaning that every image was held on the screen for 2 frames instead of 1, giving a total of 12 images per every second of animation instead of 24. And this motion is very anime-like, where you get frames that are sort of jittery and in your face with a lot of expression in them. And this is why the Spider-Verse stands out from everything around it. There has been no 3D animated movie like this ever before. The visual style of the Spider-Verse prioritizes the artistry more than the technicalities, and these imperfections make it seem like a canvas with so much character in it. And in contrast with your typical 3D animated movie, this looks nothing like them. In a 3D animated movie, the individual frames don't really matter too much, and it's only when they come together to make a scene or a sequence that makes the world come alive. And this is often something that you can observe when you pause the movie in the middle of a random scene. You see, some of these frames don't really carry too much information. But when you do this to the Spider-Verse, something entirely different happens. It's almost like it opens up a new medium full of artistic possibilities. Whether it be the comic book freeze frames that sort of pops in and out of sequences, or the abstract illustrations that exist in the background of a lot of these scenes, the pause button serves as a rabbit hole into the true potential of animation. Every sequence in the Spider-Verse is like magic, and every scene has an emotion. And unlike traditional 3D animation, every frame is a painting. Everywhere you look in the Spider-Verse, there is some form of art that tries to communicate to you in a visual language that is expressive, akin to the colors on a canvas. And this reminds me of a comment that I once read on this very topic, and although I don't quite remember the name of the person, the words were rather appropriate, and it goes something like this. Spider-Verse is brimming with art in such a way that every frame that you pause the movie on can be screen captured to be used as your wallpaper. And I really thought this was the best way to convey the beauty of Spider-Verse's animation. It is truly a work of art. There is a moment in every story that perfectly defines what the story is. Now let's call it the quintessence of the story. And every movie has one. And as it would be the case, there is a moment in the Spider-Verse that captures the true essence of everything that I have mentioned before. The scene that is perhaps the quintessence of the Spider-Verse, the leap of faith. While this is a moment when Miles overcomes his insecurities and doubts to fully embrace the hero within him, from an artistic point of view, this is the perfect example of the visual language of the film coming together with the plot, the finest form of visual storytelling, a true artistic masterpiece of a scene. And in this scene, you'll find halftones and colors and abstracts of various kinds jumping in and out of the frames, and the line work that carries the expression of every facial movement. Every jump and every run is emphasized by lines of motion and smeared colors that are very abstract, and yet they make sense of this alternate reality through an artistic style of physics. There are comic book strips and pop-up art and illustrations, and they all come together in a very distinct style of animation. An animation that is perfect for a world from a comic book. And to top it all off, unlike any other superhero movie, you have hip-hop music playing in the background. Truly distinct. But I think the leap of faith here is actually two-dimensional. One is part of the story itself, where you have a protagonist overcoming his fears and doubts to rise above and become Spider-Man. But then, in a rather different narrative, the leap of faith is indicative of this project itself. The fact that this movie even exists is based upon an idea to change the course of animation. And leading into the early days of production, none of the people involved with this project would have known what the Spider-Verse would eventually become. And it does take a certain degree of faith in your creative process to make something such as the Spider-Verse. Quite simply, a leap of faith. And this takes us back to the actual question itself. And you might be thinking, well then, did Spider-Verse actually save animation? Well, it depends on how you look at animation. Now, some might think that Western animation was doing really well even without the Spider-Verse, and you wouldn't be wrong to think that. But I think ever so often, we have a habit of mistaking animation for a genre rather than a medium. And we also forget what animation can be if given the chance. And Spider-Verse was the answer to this. It was the one time when someone gave animation a chance, and in more ways than one, it sparked an artistic revolution. It spawned a new era of animation where the visual language was talked about as much as the story. More and more movies and TV shows started keeping away from the generic mainstream look, and they started trying out new visual styles. After a really long time, art was finally back in animation. And in the grand scheme of animation, Spider-Verse might only be a drop in the ocean, but its impact on this medium is more than you could ever imagine. And this is exactly why I think Spider-Verse saved Western animation.